Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today I have on one of my few repeat guests. I don't have repeat guests that often, but Julio joins me again here today because he recently had a really cool study out, and that study is titled, and I'll also have it linked in the description below, but Muscle Hypertrophy Responses to Changes in Training Volume, a retrospective analysis. So that is what we're going to kind of cover today. So first off, Julio, what kind of led you to wanting to do this study in the first place?
Well, Ryan, it's really nice to speaking to you again and all your audience. Well, first of all, the majority of studies that assess the effects of different RT protocols in previously resistance training subjects, they usually do not account the previous training volume that each subject used to perform before initiation of the study, okay? Especially those studies that evaluate the different resistance training volumes. So we're not sure if the effects that we observe within the studies, they are strictly to the volume itself, absolute volume itself, or what's the real influence of the previous resistance training volume that each subject performed before entering the study. So is the effect related to the volume itself or the changes in training volume rather?
Interesting. So the study kind of sought out to look at, okay, now are these differences in hypertrophy a result of just doing like more or less training volume than what someone's used to, or is it just related to kind of the absolute volume that they're doing in total? So that's super interesting to me. So now to kind of get into it a little bit more here, what maybe a first good place to start is like, what is a retrospective analysis and what did you guys kind of do here for this study?
Sure. Well, a retrospective analysis, generally speaking, is also called a secondary analysis, which means that we've not implemented a training program for the subject. We got previous data that we have collected and published in studies from our laboratory, and we analyzed a secondary analysis from this data. Basically, we tried to verify associations between these changes in training volume and muscle hypertrophy outcomes. Our main question was, the subjects that experience their higher changes in training volumes are necessarily the ones that presented a larger increase in morphological outcomes. So we have three different studies that we collected data, previous studies that we collect data, and we perform this analysis and also another analysis called key cluster analysis, which means that we divide the individuals in three blocks of different resistance training schemes. So the first block consisted of individuals that had their training volume reduced during the interventions. The second block consisted of individuals that had their training volume increased up to 50% in the number of sets, weekly sets for each muscle group. And the third block consisted of only individuals that had their training volume increased above 50% on the weekly sets for biceps and triceps muscles.
Gotcha. So you were kind of looking at previously collected data in which you had individuals, a certain cohort saw decreases in training volume. Another cohort was up to 50%, and then the other was above 50% increases.
Exactly.
Does it sound like I'm understanding the different groups there?
Perfect.
Cool. And then when it came to like what you guys were measuring, was it just looking at the kind of muscle growth response, or how were you kind of looking at different measurements and things like that?
Yeah, the main variable, the independent variable, was muscle thickness change from pre to post intervention. So we got specific biceps muscle thickness and triceps muscle thickness from previous studies of our lab.
Perfect. And do you remember if these participants were, I take it they were probably at least somewhat trained, considering they were going from a certain volume in the past to a certain new volume? Is that correct? Were they all kind of at least recreationally trained?
When we look just at the training experience in years, they can be considered advanced lifters, but when we look only for strength values, strength levels, we can call them recreationally trained lifters. Okay, so they had a large experience with resistance training practice, but they did not present. We cannot call them as advanced lifters as well.
Gotcha. Cool. So it sounds like most of the participants had at least some experience lifting, and then you kind of split them out into these three different cohorts here, and you mainly looked at muscle thickness as the primary dependent variable there. So I think with that, what did you guys kind of find here? Were there large differences between the groups here, or what were kind of your results here?
So Ryan, our results basically, when we look at the associations between changes in training volume and muscle thickness response, we observe only weak to moderate correlations between these two variables, okay? Which means that the individuals that display the higher changes in training volume throughout the interventions, they were not necessarily the ones that presented the most higher magnitude response in muscle hypertrophy, okay? So this is the first find of our study. Regarding the key cluster analysis, when we compare the blocks, we observe that the only block that presents a significant increase was the block of increases above 50% of the volume sets compared to those to the block that experienced reductions in training volume. But we did not observe difference from the statistical standpoint between the block that increased volume up to 50% compared to that block that increased volume more than 50%. And when we look at the magnitude of the effect size, what we call in the statistical analysis, we observe only a moderate effect for the larger volume increase, which means that from a clinical perspective, we cannot state precisely that larger increase in training volume necessarily represent a higher response in muscle hypertrophy outcomes, okay? It's really important to stress that during studies, and not only for exercise science, we must look at the difference between groups, okay? But we also must look precisely for the size of the difference. We cannot limit our results just for a statistical analysis. They call p-value. Okay, we need to look carefully, look to the size of the difference and take into account from I would say clinical relevance of the findings.
Absolutely. And I think that that's when I see people attempting to interpret research online, I'll often see people, point to, hey, there was a significant effect of this study. And then it's like, okay, well, what was the actually effect size? Like, was there a magnitude of effect there? Did it practically mean anything? And sometimes when you kind of peel back the layers a little bit, it's like, okay, there's a significant difference, but practically speaking, it still wasn't, the effect size was still very low. So I think that is definitely an important consideration. So for this study here, it sounds like there was a significant effect when looking at the group that increased their volume for 50+%, so above 50%, and comparing that to the group that decreased volume, but the effect size was moderate. Does that sound like the primary finding here?
Perfect. Another interesting finding that I would like to stress, Ryan, is that none of the individuals that experienced the reductions in training volume throughout the intervention presented the reductions in the muscle size. Okay, what's the take point of this? If we implement the reductions training volume phases for our lifters, we should not be worried about losing morphological adaptations, reduction the magnitude of morphological adaptations, because the individuals usually they maintain a high level of effort and also a high intensity during the trainings. So that's a really interesting finding from our study. Another interesting observation is that every measurement has its typical error. Okay, so the error from different measurements is important to look during the studies. So the three blocks of 0 up to 50% and larger than 50%, they did not show difference in the number of individuals that presented increase in muscle thickness above the error of measurement. Okay, which means that from a practical standpoint, individuals can present significant hypertrophy, reduction or increasing up to 50% or increasing larger than 50% in training volume. What I am led to believe is that if an individual responds well with higher training volumes, usually he tends to respond well also with lower training volumes approaches. And the opposite is quite true. If an individual does not respond well with training volumes, maybe he will not respond as well with low training volumes either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually today, but that podcast is going to go out a week before this one does, so people listening may have already listened to that. But I interviewed Dr. Mike Roberts just a couple hours ago, actually, and he studies high and low responders, and that's what we talked about there. And we talked about some mechanisms for why people are high or low responders, and it definitely seems as though like there are some independent factors leading to someone be a lower responder rather than just training volume. So I definitely think that the research agrees with kind of what you're thinking there.
Exactly. Yeah, several factors: ribosomes, satellite cells, myonuclei, and androgenic receptors as well.
Yep, that's exactly what we talked about. So it sounds like you definitely stay up to date on that literature as well. So
yeah,
cool. I think that kind of covers things pretty well there regarding your results. Is there any other results that you kind of found interesting or maybe that surprised you regarding your study, or were those kind of the main ones there?
Yeah, Ryan, actually, it's what really surprised me was that the reductions in training volume, they did not reduce muscle size. I really expect that we could see some reductions or some variation, or from an individual standpoint, we observe some individuals presenting reductions in muscle adaptations. But it's important to stress that the design of our study does not allow us to draw causality inference. Okay, if we want to know the real effects of different training volumes approaches, increases or decreases in training volume, we should actually conduct a study, a randomized study, with different groups of different percentage increase. Let's say 20% versus 40% versus 60%. As far as I know, the laboratory from Dr. Eduardo de Souza, University of Tampa, they are conducting a study similar to this. And I think we will get pretty soon some quite interesting results regarding this question.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, especially regarding that your study specifically looked at a correlation between kind of muscle size and relative changes in volume. It wasn't necessarily looking for causality there, to which, you would definitely think that if there was a causal effect, you'd also see a correlation there. But, there's also various correlations to where it definitely doesn't make like any sort of sense. I think there's one to where it's like hot days are correlated with like more, this is going to be kind of a gruesome look, but I think hot days are correlated with like more killings or something like that. So it's like, it's not necessarily saying that hot days.
That's a great example.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not necessarily saying that there's causality there.
Yeah.
Well, I think those are some definitely good takeaways. Now, from a maybe practical perspective for someone listening to this, considering their own training program, or maybe they're a coach considering implementing changes to their own clients and stuff, are there any kind of practical takeaways regarding someone's relative training volume and muscle hypertrophy that someone should consider that maybe this study supports a bit?
Sure. I think that for coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, when they prescribe exercise training regimens for trained lifters, they must not ignore the previous training volume. Okay, I think that maybe your lifter already presents a higher training volume. So if you want to, or if you consider proper to reduce training volume, you can do so without fearing negative effects. Okay, I think that's the major takeaway, take home points from our study. And I really think that slight increase in training volume may be more suitable for most of the individuals. We must always connect increases in training volume with an individual's capacity of recovery. Okay, nutrition, sleep, and manage stress. I don't think that the relation for the risk and benefits of increasing too sudden training volume is worth for the results.
Absolutely. And I think that even when considering risk of injury, I think the research supports that one of the leading risks for injury is actually a sudden dramatic increase in training volume of kind of absolute workload for a certain athlete. As one of my professors for my graduate degree, he actually studied like athlete monitoring and stuff like that. And one of the biggest indicators for him for when an athlete might be a bit overtrained or might start experiencing some injuries is when they would see a sudden spike in their total kind of workload. So I would definitely agree that, you should definitely consider what someone's done in the past, and you shouldn't necessarily just like go ahead and increase their volume by 100%. And it should probably be kind of a gradual increase. And, there's also practical considerations regarding, generating a ton of soreness and people generally finding that uncomfortable and maybe not wanting to come back to the gym if they're like crazy sore as well from a dramatic increase in volume. So I'm definitely a fan of a gradual progression in training volume. And then also, as you mentioned, just reducing your training volume doesn't mean you're going to automatically lose muscle. And I think that's a fear that some people have is like, they never want to take a deload week or a period of reduced training loads and volumes because they're so worried about, I've built this muscle, it's so hard. I don't want to, lose it now in a period of reduced training. But I think this study, as well as some other research, supports that you can actually maintain muscle on, not a super ton amount of kind of training volume. So sound like kind of fair summary take home points there?
Sure. That's perfect. I think the main challenge of strength and conditioning coaches is to find the balance between stimulus and recovery. What Dr. Mike Israel says that the maximum recoverable volume. I think that's a really challenge for us.
Yep, absolutely. You got to find that sweet spot between a level of training that is effective and produces gains towards the goal that you want, but it's not so much in which you can't recover from it. And if you can't recover from it, you're probably not going to experience positive adaptations and get closer to your goal. So I think that's a really good take home as well. So I think with that, Julio, what's kind of next for you? What else are you working on? Is anything kind of coming down the chute for me to get you on the podcast again, or what are you kind of excited about right now?
It will be my pleasure to return here and tell more about a eventual published study. Well, basically, nowadays I'm working on 3 review papers, one regarding the effects of whole body electromyostimulation on muscle parameters. Also, I'm working another review about progression models in resistance training, and also a meta-analysis regarding training to failure in specific populations. So I hope we can get pretty good results as soon as possible.
Awesome. Well, I'm definitely going to be keeping my eye out for that. And for those listening, if they want to keep their eye out for that, is there anywhere that they can go to kind of make sure that they are following you and paying attention to kind of your publications and different things that you have going on?
Sure. I am on ResearchGate and also Instagram as Julio B. Camargo.
Well, Julio, I think we got to the point short and sweet today and kind of covered everything we needed to. So thank you so much for coming on here again. I'm definitely going to be paying attention to, like I said, the different publications you have, and make sure to give you a holler to cover those once they are fully published and stuff. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure, Ryan. I appreciate your invitation and I hope we can get soon.